What happens when drone surveillance and DNA collection laws quietly expand under the radar? In this episode of Trailblazing Justice, we break down two alarming bills in the Oregon legislature, one that loosens restrictions on warrantless drone use, and another that allows police to collect DNA from people merely arrested, not convicted. With bipartisan support pushing these bills forward, Bobbin and Zach expose the troubling implications for civil rights, transparency, and government overreach. Coming up next on Trailblazing Justice. This is Trailblazing Justice, episode 67, recorded Friday, May 30, 2025. The Surveillance Creep. It's time for Trailblazing Justice, the weekly podcast where we discuss civil and criminal rights in Oregon and beyond. Trailblazing Justice is a production of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And here's Bobbin.
Welcome back to another episode of Trailblazing Justice. I'm Bobbin Singh, the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And today I'm joined by Zach Winston, our Director of Policy and Outreach. Today we're going to be discussing some general things that are going on in Oregon that have to do with law enforcement and the expansion of law enforcement power. This will hopefully be a good lead into a follow-up conversation we hope to have in the upcoming week or so with Juan Chavez, our Director of Civil Rights Project, where we're going to do a look back, sort of a retrospective of the past 5 years since the murder of George Floyd, and how what has or hasn't changed as it relates to law enforcement accountability. But today we're just talking more at the policy level of what's going on in Oregon. But Zach, anything just before we jump into that conversation, anything catching your attention this week?
Not necessarily. I mean, generally, I'm trying to avoid anything at the federal level. But in terms of Oregon, it's been interesting. We had since the last time we talked, we had the Oregon the revenue forecast come out, which has been interesting and discusses kind of how much money Oregon has moving forward. And so that's been interesting to see how that's played through the Capitol. Otherwise, it's been relatively quiet, other than trying to fight off some bad bills, a couple of which we'll talk about today.
Yeah. So what's going on in the legislative session right now? Where are we at? So the revenue forecast has come out. It seems to suggest that we're going to have less money than what we had. Can you explain a little bit about what that means overall?
Yeah, I mean, so there's always estimates out there of what the accounts are going to look like. And previously, with all the with COVID and some federal dollars coming in, we've generally had a rosier outlook than initially anticipated at the forecast level, which is generally really good, because right now, well, I'll get on to where we are, but it's generally really good. Now we're starting to see kind of the ramifications of moving further away from COVID, but also moving into a new frontier with this administration. So so the revenue forecast was down. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was a significant amount, but not enough to make sure nothing gets funded. But it's enough that it's difficult for bills to get funded off the backs of that. And so essentially where we are currently in the session is the second chamber deadline passed, which means that essentially the bills had to have been moved out of their policy committees really by now. And what that means is that a lot of legislators start moving on, turning their attention from their policy committees, so like the judiciary or health, human services or healthcare, and turn their attention to their full ways and means, which is the budgeting committee essentially, and their subcommittees within that. And so that's when bills will start being kind of discussed for funding. And so currently that's where we kind of currently are. We're in a holding pattern right now. A lot of the agency bills will go first, so funding the various agencies, then agency funding adjacent bills, and then eventually the kind of the policy bills that we're involved in. And so a reduced revenue forecast or negative revenue forecast doesn't doesn't bode great for any bills that are trying to get funded moving forward. But we have until it sounds like they're trying to end this session. This is always an interesting thing. Legislators are always kind of like trying to dash to finish the session, which is kind of wild to me. But we're hearing they want to try to finish up by June 20th. Maybe June 27th is more realistic, but they have to be done by June 29th. So it'll be a sprint.
It's like a mad dash to the end here because it blows my mind that we're already in June,
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and it's wild because you'll have bills that are, voted out of committee. One of our bills, for example, was voted out of committee, I think in like February, March,
yeah.
and you have these bills that go out in, middle to late February. They're voted out at like Judiciary, for example, Senate Judiciary, and then they go and they just sit in Ways and Means. And that's where, you can generally, you can either lose a ton of momentum, people forget about the bill because there's a lot going on in between that. So yeah, it's wild to think that we're already coming up on June.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of this mad dash, I think the things that we wanted to talk about are what sort of invited you to talk about were some of the policy bills that are pending in the legislature that have to do with the expansion of law enforcement power. I mean, some of these bills to me are the two particular bills that we're going to talk about are so befuddling to me in so many different ways. But most importantly, I think what's surprising is that both these bills have received Democratic support in the legislature. It's an expansion of law enforcement powers in ways that don't make any sense and seem completely disconnected from the moment that we're in as it relates to what's happening at the federal level. It seems like if we were to do anything, if we were being responsive and protective of civil rights, we would be doing everything we could to sort of reduce the footprint of law enforcement in this moment, to ensure that these systems couldn't be used against us by the federal government, or information that these systems gather couldn't be used by the federal government. But these two bills do the exact opposite. So with that said, you want to give us a preview of the two bills? One of them has to do with drone surveillance, the other one with the collection of DNA evidence. Why don't we start with the drone one, since that's the one that is, why don't you explain sort of where that is procedurally, what the bill is and where it is procedurally?
Yeah. So, and just to be clear, so one of them is the drone bill is supported, does have bipartisan support. And the DNA collection bill doesn't really, but it's gotten through. So that I guess is technically some support. But anyway, it's less outwardly supported. So so the what we call the drone bill, which is SB 238, and then A as in Apple, has already made it out of the Senate. And then is moving into so it's over on the House side, so it's in House Judiciary, so it doesn't have a fiscal, right? So the process it would take is it goes from Senate Judiciary over to the Senate floor, voted out of the Senate floor, and then it goes over to the House Judiciary, and then if it makes it out of House Judiciary, it makes it then to the House floor. Now, this is kind of an interesting one because it was coming up on the deadline, and they decided to move it to House Rules, and the Rules Committee doesn't play by the same timeline, the same deadlines that the other policy committees do, and so it was moved there kind of for safe harbor, and to potentially to be worked on. Now, I would say a lot of bills go there to die. And legislators don't just necessarily want to kill them in the policy committee, so they send them over to rules. This seems a lot more likely to be an instance where they're actually going to try to be moving it out of there. So that's where we're currently sitting. We're sitting in House Rules Committee. It just got over there on the 28th, like officially. And so then it would presumably potentially, depending on how it goes, it would get a public hearing, and then a work session in rules, and then it would move to the House floor.
Yeah, I mean, the politicking behind this, I mean, I'm speculating looking just from the outside, but the fact that it moved from House Judiciary to rules, I mean, this is, like you said, like just like a maneuver to, one, keep the bill alive, but also suggested with the fact that they didn't have the votes in House Judiciary to get it out, and they're moving it into a different committee potentially to sort of ensure that they get the votes out to the House floor for a vote. So, there is like I mean, there is politicking, even in a kind of like smaller state like Oregon with a part-time legislative body. You see these like political maneuvers that happen in order to keep bills moving or keep these policy ideas or concepts, quote unquote, alive, so they can, so people who are supporting it can get it passed. So it's a bit like I would say I find it a bit offensive, from a democratic standpoint, like a small d democratic standpoint, that it's seeming to circumvent the ability for public commentary, or public testimony. It keeps, I think, civil rights organizations and groups and the public kind of guessing, like a whack-a-mole, trying to figure out like where the bill is at, how to oppose it, how to get information out in front of it. So this is like the kind of sleight of hand that we've seen in the Oregon legislature before, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I mean, there's arguable, I mean, I think an argument can be made that the politicking may be more even, I guess, intense or prevalent at the state level than the federal level, just because there's fewer eyes on it, right? So, there's a few organizations that are watching this, and if those organizations aren't paying attention, then this goes completely unnoticed. And so, yeah, it's arguably a lot easier for legislators to do that. But yeah, this is something where, even now we're also just keeping in mind that there's other tactics they could take, right? So we mobilize, for example, if we put out a call to action to oppose this bill to our supporters, and the ACLU does that as well. We get all these emails generated saying, don't, reject, SB 238A. There's other bills that are related to drones that could be potentially through other maneuvering substituted in for this bill, right? So like there's tactics that could still be used, and now all of a sudden we would have had all this mobilization on this one bill, and now they could potentially move it to something else. And so there's plenty of different permutations and formulas that they can use to try and move these bills past past objection from the community. I mean, we saw this with HB 4002 last session, which effectively repealed Measure 110, and community organizations and the community at large, I think, generally feeling unheard from legislators. And I think that's kind of something this fosters, that feeling of just, we have, community groups have opposition to the bill, and instead of engaging in those conversations, there's generally some gamesmanship going on, and it's quite frustrating.
Yeah, and what I want to say is this is politics. I mean, like it's not personal in the sense of like, you know, like I get it. This is part of the stuff legislators do. So, you have to expect it. You have to be ready for it. There's bills like this that always kind of go through these different kind of maneuvers in order to get them passed because they're controversial or there's, opposition from certain segments of our society or, professional organizations like ours. So it's just, it's incumbent on us to be prepared and to be able to put out the information to explain why we oppose this. And hopefully legislators will hear that, and we can catch up with the maneuvering. So, it's just something that I want to emphasize. Like, this is just part of politics. Like, we have to just
Yeah.
accept that this is how it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also not as clear cut generally as just, it's not black and white, right? So there's a ton of nuance to it, right? So like an example on this bill is the bill didn't seem to have the votes to make it to be voted out of House Judiciary, like to pass through House Judiciary. And so it what ends up happening is, right, then it's proposed to go to rules, and that's like essentially a lateral move, which the unwritten rules, the etiquette, the whatever you want to call it, the parliamentarism or whatever it is of the Oregon legislature says essentially you really should, this unwritten rule is don't vote against bills being kind of moved to a different committee essentially. And there's there's a divide, I think, in legislators of whether they follow kind of these unwritten rules or not. And so in this vote, it was interesting. We did see two legislators who voted no to moving the bill to rules, which is, I thought was quite surprising to see, and quite interesting to see. And so, but that doesn't mean necessarily that those who voted, certain legislators who voted to move the bills to rules, actually support the bill, right? So I think there's definitely nuance involved there. You can't just look at the votes and say, oh, this means this means that. And that's why it's important to just, get the nuance of what's actually going on, because there are still legislators, I believe, that oppose the bill, but didn't necessarily want to step on toes by opposing the move to rules.
Yeah, I think it's a good explanation. It's sort of procedurally sort of where we're at and kind of a high level sort of overview of the politics. I think, like you said, there's nuance to this. And these are things that we're sort of familiar with. So, between us and some of the other groups, we were prepared. I mean, at the end of the day, it's sort of like if the legislators or key legislators, especially leadership, continue to engage in sort of these maneuvers, they can just ram through these bills despite opposition from groups like ours, and, all things being equal, the civil rights community, we're, I think, very important. We have a good voice. We're trying to protect Oregonians. But as far as its overall influence on the legislative body, it's really just it's not clear sometimes like how much influence there is, or in certain instances we seem to have like a lot of influence, in certain instances we don't. Like I think the repeal of Measure 110 was a really good example in recent years where the social service community and the civil rights community came out basically in clear opposition to the rollbacks of Measure 110 with House Bill 4002, basically recriminalizing drugs and sort of digging back into the war on drugs. And what you saw was basically the business community really come out very much in support of this bill, the business lobby and some other moneyed interests that really supported, the rollbacks. And that's where, it really is challenging to figure out who legislators really want to listen to. And so it's all to say, like, we'll find out whether or not legislators will fall on the side of civil rights or, in this instance, fall on the side of law enforcement. But can you explain a little bit about what this bill does? Because now that we understand sort of procedurally where it's at.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also just one thing to add on to what you just said is it would be a really nice world if we could get the kind of maneuvering that some of these bills get to help pass some bills that affirm civil rights or that improve conditions for our most vulnerable.
Wouldn't that be amazing?
Wouldn't that be great? So, it's not to say there aren't legislators that do amazing job championing bills that we bring, but the shrewd maneuvering from leadership doesn't necessarily happen on those related bills. But anyway, yeah. So the bill 238A, it essentially allows, and I'm going to do some reading, some not reading, but just to get the point across, it essentially allows for the warrantless deployment of drones for law enforcement. Now, that's really simplified, but essentially, currently, law enforcement can use a drone in kind of two situations: if there was a warrant issued authorizing the use of the drone, or if the law enforcement agency has probable cause to believe that a person has committed a crime, is committing a crime, or is about to commit a crime, and exigent circumstances exist, right? So exigent circumstances we hear a lot in Fourth Amendment law, but also just generally in allowing law enforcement kind of to do whatever they want because certain circumstances exist. So
it's certainly an emergency situation. It's like where getting a warrant would basically prevent them from either stopping a crime or it's in the midst of a crime, things like that, right? That's what they mean by exigent.
Yeah, I mean, and exigent circumstances generally are whatever they really want them to be, honestly. If they can articulate a reason for why it's, there's exigent circumstances, then they kind of generally get there. The courts oftentimes will side with them on that. And another time we can see drones already being used is search and rescue, for example, right? So this is already what they're allowed to do, and already what they're doing. Um, the difference is in what this bill does. And just real quick, I want to back up and say why warrants are so important, because that is essentially what they're scrapping, what they're trying to get rid of in the new bill. Warrants are applications to the court, to a judge, to authorize the action, whether a search or the use of a drone or arrest, for example, to authorize that action. And they have to apply for it, and it's on the record, and they have to put in their reason for why they need to do it. And the current law also says that in no event may a warrant provide for the operation of a drone for a period of more than 30 days, right? So there's a limitation right there in the current statute on that. And so what we often see from law enforcement is a desire to try and find ways to cut the courts out, and to avoid judicial oversight and judicial authority. And one of the ways to do that is to try and find ways to chip away at the warrant requirement. And so I don't know any other way to possibly read this bill other than to say that it's literally trying to just work. It's an end around the warrant requirement. And so the proposed language as it currently stands, says similar information, right? So a law enforcement agency may operate a drone, acquire information through the operation of a drone, or disclose information acquired through the operation of a drone, in connection with quote unquote lawful police activity, which is wildly broad, when the law enforcement agency is, and then has a list. And so when law enforcement is responding to any call for law enforcement services, responding to a public safety emergency in which personal injury or damage to property could occur, conducting search and rescue operations, conducting training, obtaining information about a property when the property owner has consented, executing a warrant, responding to exigent circumstances that make it unreasonable for law enforcement to obtain a warrant authorizing use of an unmanned aircraft system, and operating an unmanned drone as authorized by a warrant issued by a court, which honestly makes no sense in this, because there's no reason for them to go get a warrant when all these other options exist. So that is what it's changing, right? So it's taking out this, you can only use it two times: exigent circumstance in two circumstances, exigent circumstances, search and rescue, that bucket, or with a warrant, with the court saying, yes, you can go do this. Here are the parameters set by the court. And now it's saying, well, I just read off what it's saying. And so I know some of the, we can talk about some of the ramifications of that as we see it. But it really is just broadening out the use of drones. It tries to, I think, arguably mitigate, by saying it can't fly with it can't record while flying to the thing. But this is all essentially the guardrails that do exist in the bill are all basically, the way I like to say it is, trust us, bro. Like, it's the cops saying, hey, listen, we got this. Like, the law says we can't do this, and we're not, we're going to follow the law. History shows us that is not the case. It's actually probably the exception rather than the rule, where law enforcement actually follows the law as written. So, the whole guardrails being that they're going to police themselves just doesn't really fly, I think, for us.
When has that ever worked out? Like, I think this is the thing that's fascinating. Is like, history has shown, I think, two things. One, when we expand law enforcement power, it never comes back. Like, we can never get it back. And it's always a slippery slope, or, it continues sort of on a trajectory of continuing to expand power, because they just, it never stops with the last grant of power or whatever that you have. The second thing, there has never been an instance in the history of law enforcement in which any power that's been granted to them hasn't been abused or misused. I mean, it's a human-centered operation, right? Like, I mean, these are individuals subject to good days, bad days, blurring the lines, whatever it may be, misconduct, people who abuse the situation, people who have their own interpretations of like how things should be. And you always get abuse of this stuff. So there's not a situation or a power that law enforcement has ever had that's not been abused. So it will be abused. That is the question. So, I mean, just going back to what this bill does it do like, I mean, can you sort of reinforce, like, does it do or give law enforcement any additional powers or any additional ways in which to use the drones that it doesn't currently have? Or, I mean, are there, I mean, I
I,
guess
I
maybe
mean,
I
I think
articulate it
the
right, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
yeah, I mean, I think the answer is no. I mean, when law enforcement has testified on the bill, first off, the written testimony generally is pretty sparse. It's pretty this is a tool that we need. We need the legislature to help us out here. But with very few examples or any examples. And then the live testimony, the oral testimony was talking about various times that drones have helped them. But by giving those examples, they're already showing that they can do it, that they just have to get a warrant. I mean, that is literally so like I no, I mean, I think the answer is that any of these reasons that they list here would all be potentially valid reasons under, for getting a warrant to fly a drone. It's just they don't want to do that. Now they may argue that it takes too much time to get a warrant, but that unfortunately you know that's what stands between us and our rights being violated. And if that's half an hour that law enforcement has to wait for that seems to be a reasonable trade-off for protecting our civil rights and our privacy.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not like the time, right? You have like basically what would be like a neutral party, a judge, basically verifying or validating the reason for the use of the drone. But I think more importantly, there creates like a historical record of the usage of drones. Because like right now, if law enforcement is able to use it without a warrant, basically when it feels like it needs to use it, there's not a historical record, like a way in which to easily track when drones are being used, how it's recording information, if it's recording information. I mean, the only way you ever really find out about this stuff, unfortunately, is like in the context of either a civil or criminal case when you're asking for discovery, and you're trying to see what law enforcement had in the context of a prosecution or a civil rights lawsuit in which, law enforcement is being produced, at which point, you're then given the information about what was used to either create probable cause for the arrest, or justify whatever actions that they took. But without that, I mean, we just don't know what's going on, right?
We don't know what's going on. You know, Arguably an amendment here that allows for data collection of like when they're actually flying it would be great. But then we can never trust that because it's self-reported by law enforcement. I think the other piece to here is the the warrants are important, yes, for documenting it and having it public record, and then having it signed off on. The 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 harm, one of the harms is the police deciding what is lawful police activity, and there's no challenge, there's no check to that. They could just do it. And I guess like you said, we start finding out about these things in lawsuits, and even then this would be, I think, really difficult to kind of drum up in a lawsuit, unless there was something explicitly involving the drone, that was responding or whatever being used. So I just think that it's so, and I know, you're going to talk with Juan about this, or we'll talk about this with Juan, but the backsliding that we've seen where there was this scrutiny of law enforcement and this, understanding that, they hold a ton of power. Let's make sure that we're watching what they're doing, and let's make sure that we have the ability to check and balance what they're doing. And this goes the complete opposite direction. This is literally well, we trust them. They've never, clearly they're not going to do any harm. Clearly they're going to abide by the law. Clearly they're not going to do anything. And let's just let them do it and let them police themselves, and let's not have anyone check them.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk more about this with Juan, sort of the backsliding, or it's not even backsliding as much as just a complete um there's no longer sort of the veneer or what is it? The the performance of
Or rhetoric.
acknowledging the history of police abuse and misconduct and violence and how that's tied into white supremacy and how, communities have been subjected to horrific violence and abuse and trauma because of these systems. Like after the murder of George Floyd, what we saw was, I guess, what was a head fake towards some understanding or recognition of that, with a lot of sort of like performative and symbolic kind of gestures and talks and, resolutions and commitments. But when you see like the rollback of Measure 110, there's other examples, but that's like the biggest one. And then you see, um, the legislature beginning to try to pass laws that would expand police powers in ways that are completely unnecessary, but for law enforcement simply to have the power. It seems like this is just like a very strong statement saying that that they're just okay with sort of ignoring that happened in 2020 and all the things that were sort of surfaced, even just for what would be like on a time scale a second, in the country's history.
Yeah, and I mean, it also just, one of the disturbing things about this, and you've mentioned the fact that, unchecked authority from law enforcement or any tools that law enforcement is quote unquote given, oftentimes end up targeting or disproportionately targeting, communities of color, vulnerable communities. And this, I think, obviously will have a similar outcome. I think, when questioned about this at the hearings, again, it comes down to like, will you use this at a protest? And the answer is, well, no, this isn't, we don't say the word protest anywhere in the bill. And that's just such, it's disingenuous because I can think of a few of these itemized, reasons that could be used within, for monitoring, filming, sending a drone out, to observing a protest, right? So, responding to any call for law enforcement services. I mean, if one cop out at a protest, puts out a call for law enforcement services, or if someone, if
Yeah,
a,
private citizen or whatever. Yeah.
yeah, so in opposition or whatever, or just anyone, honestly, if you just know there's a protest going on, you say that they need to respond. Well, that's a drone being deployed, and that's going to see everyone there. Responding to a public safety emergency in which personal injury or damage to property could occur. We know that potential property damage has been used to initiate all sorts of law enforcement action, generally in the form of excessive force. From law enforcement in the past, this explicitly says that's a reason that you can deploy, acquire information, and disclose information acquired by the drone. The other one would be, obtaining information about a property when the property owner has consented. We've seen a lot of the business community, in the past and in Portland be very frustrated by protests. And so if you have those property owners basically all saying to the police, we want you to fly drones out, we're giving you consent to fly the drones over our property, and we want you to obtain information about a property, and we consent to it, well, that could be in here, and that's going to be that's going to be seeing everyone who's protesting. And then you have the same exigent circumstances as well. And so I just think that it absolutely could be used at a protest. I think one of the officers who was responding to one of the questions from a legislator at the hearing, was saying, well, no, we wouldn't really be able to use them. And I think the legislator made a point like, well, if you think that someone's about to commit a crime, you send the drone can observe them. Um, and the officer was like, yes, just them. And it's like, well, but they're in they're in a protest. It's recording and stuff and acquiring all that information, all that surveillance. So
Yeah, and there's other laws that restrict, the ability for law enforcement to record. So, this can come in sort of I mean, there's just to be, completely sort of contextual, there are some restrictions on how law enforcement can record things, but this drone sort of bill really sort of begins to blur the lines and make it far more difficult to allow those guardrails to be fully enforced because of the things that you're saying.
it also goes to who's the check on this, right? So, arguably, so ORS 181A as an Apple 0.250, gives specific information not to be collected or maintained. So no law enforcement agency may collect or maintain information about the political, religious, or social views, associations, or activities of any individual, group, association, organization, corporation, business, or partnership under such information directly, unless such information directly relates to an investigation of criminal activities, and there are reasonable grounds to suspect the subject of the information is or may be involved in criminal conduct. Now, there's a lot of caveats within that. That's one of, so like these guardrails just aren't, I think, as airtight as I think law enforcement likes to make out to be and legislators understand. Even just in that statute, who knows what they're doing, right? We don't generally find these things out until, as you mentioned, potentially a lawsuit. But oftentimes it's found out because actions are taken by law enforcement, and the only way that they can possibly take those actions is because they clearly have information that they probably shouldn't have been keeping.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it does arguably exist some guardrails, but they are not sufficient, and they are especially not sufficient if you understand that law enforcement is incapable of policing themselves.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I think I asked you, have proponents of the bill actually really identified, you've already kind of answered this in the inverse, but like, have proponents of this bill really identified a situation in which they need this?
I mean, not that I've heard, maybe behind the scenes to legislators, there is something there. I mean, I think everything that I've heard around this are situations where they could arguably already deploy them again because they could use them for I guess there are times they're talking, they sometimes talk about search and rescue efforts and the law being more clear on that. And that, I think a lot of the advocates have said that's fine. Like, that's fine. That makes, if you need to do some, tweaks to the language of statutes that relate to that, then go for it. Like search and rescue operations, don't necessarily, at least in what they're talking about, really infringe, at least that we can see on civil rights. It's but everything that they say they need to use, that they need this bill for, can already be done. It's, again, they just don't want to have to go get a warrant for it.
Yeah. And I think more than anything, like when I think about this bill, going back just to more like the conceptual level or the values, it just seems like at this time, expanding law enforcement power, like, I would say, like, even with the public defense crisis that's going on right now, from a value statement, I would say the legislature and the governor just needs to prevent the creation of new crimes, period. Like, we have a bloated criminal system. There's enough criminal codes on the book that people can get prosecuted for, actions that violate some statute. Like, we don't need more criminal statutes. Like, we have enough on the books, but every session there's always new criminal codes or slight expansions of the ability for prosecutors to be able to prosecute. But it just seems like, with a public defense crisis that's going on, there should be just this understanding, until we can resolve the constitutional crisis that's happening, there should be a pause or a hold on the creation of new crimes as to not continue to bloat the criminal system. It seems to me like in this moment where we're talking about uh, attacks on democracy, attacks on the rule of law, authoritarianism, like the way in which the U.S. Department of Justice and FBI is being politicized, and those structures are being used to target political advocate or political opposition and civil rights advocates and things like that. So there should be just like a general understanding from the state leadership that we just need to pause anything that expands law enforcement footprint at this point, no matter what. Like this could be, let's say this was like completely reasonable and needed to happen for some reason, but like in this moment, just because we can't fully understand the unintended consequences, it's just have a pause for just like a couple of years until we can at least hopefully get out of sort of the situation that we're in and not have people in power that are just abusing, abusing executive power and just dismantling our democratic institutions.
Yeah, and it's not an unreasonable. Agencies do this all the time on our bills, which is like, whoa, this is way too quick. There's so many potential unintended consequences that we don't even know. We need to, study this. We need to have a work group. We need to have a task, whatever. There's all sorts of different variations on that. And when we say that, when advocates say to legislators, oftentimes it doesn't resonate nearly as much as when agencies say it. And yet here is a perfect example of a bill that, to your point, with everything else going on, it seems like there should be further discussions in the interim. The short session's just around the corner. Let's have some conversations around it. Like, let's let the community be heard on their concerns. When you see who is this? The chief of police for Portland Police, submits testimony in support of the bill, and it's talking about how really this would be helpful because they're facing staffing challenges. Like that's what's in this testimony. Like many law enforcement, I'm quoting from it, like many law enforcement agencies, we continue to face significant staffing challenges. And they blame that for response time being low. And then that's the reason they need drones to be able to respond. I mean, this is not something where it needs to be addressed this session. And we're told that we've been told that on bills that we've run this session.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not an unreasonable ask for us to say, can we just take a second, have conversations outside of the session, outside of the crunch time of the end of the session, especially, and let's talk about it.
I mean, so House Bill 238A, it's in Ways and Means. And, just for the pure intention of this,
it's in House rules.
House rules, sorry. Thanks, House rules. But just for the purpose of this podcast, what we're really discussing are the impacts of this bill, that it is an anti-civil rights bill. And that's the way that I think people should understand it. Now, if you're for civil rights, I think the answer is clear about like where you should stand on this bill. If you don't care about civil rights, and I think, and pro law enforcement, then I think the answer is clear where you stand on this bill. But, I think what we're just really trying to show is like the impacts of what this bill does and sort of like at least our interpretation or perceptions of like or impressions of like what's happening with the legislature. But this bill is just like one of two bills that are like problematic. The other bill, that's the one in Ways and Means, but is also like this one like frustrates me to a very high level because it received bipartisan support. But this is a DNA collection bill for individuals who are arrested, not convicted, but that are arrested for felonies. Law enforcement be able to collect their DNA. Is that right?
That's right. And just to be clear, there are more than two bills that are problems and concerning.
But we're just using this as sort of symbolic of this movement back towards expanding law enforcement and away from sort of where we were in 2020.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and if they fall into buckets, another bucket is so many new crimes and increased penalties are being passed as well. So that could be for a different day. But yeah, so this is House Bill 3093. And so it has all Republican sponsors. And it does, right? You did sum it up pretty well. It's a relatively simple bill. It allows for police to obtain a blood or buccal sample if you're arrested for a person felony, a sex crime, or burglary in the first degree. Um, and that's at arrest, which I think is just the mind-blowing part of this bill is taking DNA samples from people who are very much at the beginning of the innocent until proven guilty justice system.
Yeah. So what is the purpose of this bill? I mean, we've heard all sorts of wacky sort of descriptions or, the intent of this bill. What are people saying this bill should be used for?
They're they're saying essentially that the bill should be used could be used um, for two reasons. One, to potentially solve other crimes, right? If you get it sooner, then you don't have to wait until a conviction. You can run any DNA against you know um against DNA that's been collected at other crime scenes, I guess. And then wildly, what is also discussed is that it could be used for exonerations, um which doesn't really make much sense to me. Essentially what they're saying is if we can take it at arrest, again, you don't have to wait until conviction. We could take it at arrest, and if it comes back matching DNA in a case that's already been solved, quote unquote solved, then it could lead to exonerations. I mean, that that is some political gymnastics.
Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's lots of layers of problems with this. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I think the biggest thing is like this just creates motivation and pretext for people to be stopped and arrested for felonies. And then that way they can just collect DNAs, right? DNA evidence.
Yeah, it's huge, right? The difference between being convicted, which is either through a plea or through a finding of guilty, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, versus arrest, which is probable cause to arrest. That's, I mean, there's a wide, there's a wide difference between those burdens of proof. And correct, right? You could, if you have a political enemy and you want, to get them arrested, for example, well, now you got their DNA, potentially. So yes, the answer is yes. It absolutely will incentivize arrests, potentially early arrests, to just obtain DNA from individuals. Um, yeah, and another piece, just to real quick throw out another infuriating part of this, which is that um, if you are if it's followed by an acquittal, dismissal, or reversal of the conviction, then it can be destroyed. The sample could be destroyed, but you have to request that it be destroyed. Which, if we know one thing in the criminal justice system, it's that anytime you make it so that people have to request it, and oftentimes, some people will, but oftentimes people don't. And that is also just incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. What, we don't trust the government to destroy the evidence?
I don't trust the government for anything.
Yeah. Not only destroy it, but like um yeah, the fact that it's on the burden on the people to request the destruction of it is also, kind of ridiculous. I don't think this bill is going to go anywhere. I hope it doesn't. I mean, we'll have to have like it'll be I mean, I think this is one of those bills that will just be so upsetting and alarm the civil rights community if it moves, that hopefully there'll be like sufficient pushback on it. But again, this is one of those things where it's not understanding the moment. Like, do we really want local law enforcement with the authority to be able to collect DNA evidence on potentially like bogus or pretextual kind of arrests to create a database of DNA that can then be compromised, can be used by the federal government, that can be used, I don't know, can be, there's always security breaks and risks and, what is it, breaches and stuff like that. I mean, it just seems pretty ridiculous to me right now that this is something that's even on the table for consideration.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, some people may be wondering, well, how does a bill introduced and supported by all Republicans, how does that make it to Ways and Means? How does it make it out of committee? Well, the answer to that is that two Democrats in House Judiciary voted in favor of moving it out of the committee and into Ways and Means. So they voted it affirmatively for it. Now it has $2 million fiscal per biennium, and for at least the next two biennia. So, I do think that's another aspect of this is that, when we're being told that the forecast is really, the revenue forecast is negative, and that, that means that we need to be, unfortunately, a lot of our bills are probably going to face, the possibility of not being funded simply because there's no money. Well, really? So there's no money for that, but there potentially is money, I guess, for collecting DNA at arrest. It's hopefully this doesn't advance any further. But it's disappointing to see two Democrats voting in favor of the bill to get it to Ways and Means.
And again, it goes back to like this conceptual or value-based understanding. Like here we have a bill that will allow law enforcement to be able to use drones in unchecked ways to surveil Oregonians. Then you have this other bill that gives law enforcement the power to essentially to collect DNA evidence. And, granted, like there's still like the requirement that someone's arrested for a felony, but there's ways to like to force that, like to, if it wanted to be abused, it could be abused, to try to just get someone's DNA evidence. I mean, this is like an invasion of privacy of like in some of the most profound ways, right? Like because when you're arrested for a crime, one of the first things that most people should get is an attorney to be able to, prevent them from speaking to law enforcement, self-incriminate or anything like that. Part of that would be not giving up your DNA evidence, to people. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think a telling piece here is, and to not let them off the hook, I like to call them out when I can. The Oregon District Attorneys Association, which arguably just literally is about taking away civil rights of Oregonians. But anyway, in their written testimony on this bill, one sentence that they have here is these DNA profiles will help police investigate and solve serious crimes that have already been committed or will be committed in the future.
really
Great.
committed in the future.
Committed in the future. Yeah. Future crimes is in here. But also, that is what's done. That's why you collect it upon conviction. So you can now, like, we're not, I mean, I guess arguably we're talking about a lot longer now because because Oregonians can't get public defenders assigned to them. And so the cases are taking forever. And so I guess the DAs are now saying, well, because because the DAs have charged so many cases and the public defenders can't keep up with it, and now people are potentially taking longer to get to trial or longer to plea out. Well, now we agree that they should be swabbed or DNA should be collected upon arrest. I mean, it is. Why? What is the movie Minority Report? Is that the future crimes? I can't remember what the movie is. I don't know. Some listener will know what it is, but yeah, it's just.
Oh, it's with Tom Cruise, right?
Tom Cruise, yeah.
Yeah. What is that?
I don't know. Anyway, this is a thing of science fiction horror. The fact that just getting arrested gets your DNA collected. Report. Yeah, it is okay. It is. Yeah. I mean, it's just so unacceptable because but they can already do this. They just have to do it upon conviction.
Yeah.
And if someone's not convicted, they should never have been subjected to having their DNA collected. It's
I mean, the thing is, it's like because like we need to make clear, like when someone's arrested for a crime and law enforcement have probable cause, they typically need a warrant to be able to collect biological samples. Like they need to go get a warrant to be able to, you know, get it because there has to show some relevancy to the conviction that occurred or the crime that they're investigating. It's not what this is different in the sense that it's just collecting it basically to have it and just to test against a bunch of other stuff just to see if they committed a crime, right? Like it's not that they have probable cause or know that they've committed another crime or think that they've committed another crime or connected to another crime. This is just like, let's just throw it in there and see what happens without any sort of probable cause. And that is not probable cause. I mean, it's not probable cause connected to the reasons for what they're arrested for. So, what we're talking about is like a database just to have, and
it's just building. It's literally just building out their DNA database, which, again, when we see, there's the Koberger trial in Idaho, I think Idaho, where they're using, I can't remember, it's 23andMe or whatever, these private companies, and they're pulling DNA that's been submitted to those for law enforcement purposes. They're, like they're the amount of DNA that's being collected and surveyed and compiled essentially for the government to have is quite immense. And I don't know why Oregon legislators would want to increase that. I also just think it's so disingenuous to say, well, this could potentially help with exonerations.
As an organization that runs the Oregon Innocence Project, I mean, I don't think like anyone here would ever say something as ridiculous as that. This is
Right.
sort of like the stuff that we're seeing at the federal level where people are quote unquote fighting anti-Semitism or
Right.
protecting First Amendment, right? I mean, it's a perversion or an inversion of
But also,
these things.
especially when you consider how difficult it is for a lot of our clients to actually get DNA testing when they're after they're wrongfully convicted. So yeah, it's an extremely disappointing bill. We do hope it doesn't pass. And it's not just hope. We are working to let legislators know our concerns around the bill.
Yeah, and hopefully they'll hear those concerns. Um, I mean, again, it just goes to the value statement of what it is that, like, what is that, what are we trying to accomplish? Like, what is the legislature trying to accomplish with these bills? And, like, why does it feel so disconnected from what's actually happening? Because I think if anyone's paying attention to what's happening at the federal level, it would almost seem ridiculous to be able to propose or push along bills like this that do these types of things. Wouldn't you agree? I mean,
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
kind of like a leading question, right?
yeah, I mean, I think it's I think oftentimes legislators are willing to, this is obviously a generalization, but they're willing to or able to or just do differentiate like law enforcement in other states and law enforcement in, federal law enforcement and actions at the federal level from, the leaders of the law enforcement agencies that they interact with on a daily basis within Oregon, right? I mean, I always talk about how Oregon generally thinks it's a special snowflake. And so you bring in examples in other states, and legislators will find ways to dance around why that wouldn't work in Oregon. And we're not saying it needs to be a one-to-one, copy paste, but if an idea is working in another state, it's worth considering. But oftentimes that's dismissed pretty quickly. But yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. I think, leaders in Oregon law enforcement have, the doors are generally pretty open to legislators, and if they are saying they need stuff, they want stuff. It's politically, I think, better for legislators to generally align with the law enforcement leaders in the community. And so right now I think legislators are very much leaning into um, this belief of buying into this tough on crime, that they need to be tough on crime or not be soft on crime, which is just, for legislators not to engage in the nuance that is necessary in this conversation and just really go, just is this is this tough on crime or is this soft on crime? And that's how they vote. I mean, that's absurd. Um, Without thinking everything through on it. So, yeah, I mean, I think the answer is, if they really were to think about it and weigh the concerns that we have, um, because we're oftentimes proven right, like, not to toot our own horn, it's just like a lot of our concerns generally end up being correct. I mean, we see it with the Department of Corrections. We saw it, in some of our lawsuits that we have going, that our concerns oftentimes uh, turn out to be what's actually happening, and this is another example. I mean, I think, if this passes, we end up talking about how did Oregon compile a database of DNA, that they're now using for X, Y, and Z. So
Yeah, and having drones watch us while they collect
yeah,
data.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the other thing too, just to go back to the drones, is like drones. I think someone made this. I can't remember there's a coalition in opposition to it, and I should, give a shout out to ACLU of Oregon, who's done a lot of work on opposing this as well. But someone made the point of, like, the drones aren't labeled. Like, it's not like a big helicopter, LAPD or PPB, right? It's a tiny little drone that you can't actually see. So you don't know that law enforcement is surveilling you. You know that there's a drone there potentially, but that could be a commercial drone. That could be, a Stalker X. That could be the police. That could be anyone. And that's another concerning thing when you start having just drones flying around watching you. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I mean, we'll follow up with a conversation on one to talk more about law enforcement, but this is sort of where we're at in Oregon. Like, I think this is a clear kind of about face of from, what we saw in 2020. What we're seeing is Oregon public officials considering the expansion of law enforcement power and, numerous in a couple different ways. And like you said, this doesn't even get into the expansion of prosecution power or the powers of the DAs. And it just seems to me like we're at a time where we really need to be considering how we expand or bloat the criminal system and what powers we give to law enforcement. And I think to the point that you made, that was really good. It's, they do this to us all the time with reforms in which we're trying to make the criminal system engage more humanely or treat people with dignity. Everyone's like, oh, no, 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 we got to slow this down. Like, our survivor defendant bill that would provide survivors of domestic violence who are charged with crimes the ability to be able to present that evidence to judges so they can get out of mandatory minimums. People are opposed to that because they're afraid of the slippery slope that God knows how many people in prison may petition or try to misuse or abuse this law. But you talk about like this drones or collection of DNA evidence in which we have a history ripe with misconduct and abuse, like with law enforcement agencies. But no, that's not going to happen, or we don't have to worry about that. There's enough safeguards in place. Let's push this through. And we say, let's slow this down and think about the unintended consequences or the slippery slope that happens. It gets ignored. So
yeah.
it's kind
It,
of,
it,
yeah.
it's just funny too, because, like, the amount of hypotheticals we get thrown at us on a lot of our bills of, like, the unintended consequences are just wild. It's like,
Mhm.
all these things that are just, completely out of left field, versus, again, with the drones, where we literally have testimony from law enforcement saying we need to fly more drones. We want for more reasons without having to get judicial oversight. So it's not like we're talking in hypotheticals here. Like, we know that this is going to lead to increased drone use by law enforcement, increased surveillance, and yet we're able to be slowed down by, outlandish hypotheticals, and we have, like, concrete of, like, this is going to do this, and we're telling you this is going to be the result at the end of it, and we're being told that that's not really much of a concern for certain
Yeah.
people.
We'll talk more about that because I think we're going to have additional conversations about survivor defendant, GIPA, and things like that. But um, Yeah, well, today's conversations was just generally about what's going on in Oregon with law enforcement expansion. We'll be back with some additional episodes on solitary. Steve Wax will be back with another edition of Waxing Confidential. And we'll follow up with Juan to talk about what's happened on law enforcement oversight since George Floyd and just general issues around where we're at with police accountability. So stay tuned. A full agenda of podcast recordings coming up in the next couple of weeks. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Trailblazing Justice. And thanks to Zach and our producer, Todd Davilev. See you next time.